want to welcome you all here today to mark an important point in the Internet's history. And one of the reasons that we all have jobs here at ICANN is because of these three gentlemen. It's an understatement to say that these three men are legends in the development of the Internet. I think most of you know who they are. For those that don't, I'll introduce them in just a minute. But my first question is not to these guys, it's to you guys. Does anyone know what happened on July 20, 1969? Anybody at all, 50 years ago? Oh, really? Come on. No, Steve, you don't get to answer.
Wait, July?
July.
July, not October.
Correct.
The first email, like the first text transmission?
Let's say again, Mark.
Moon launch?
Yes, the first lunar landing. Really? He's the only one that got that?
You missed that, right.
That's pretty well known, right? I mean, we all are familiar with Neil Armstrong's first walk on the moon.
Yep.
What many people are not familiar with is 3 months later, the first message was sent over the Arpanet, which was the precursor to the Internet. Not too many people are aware of that. That's what we're here celebrating today, is that first message. It's sort of considered by many the unofficial birth of the Internet. There are other dates, it's a debate within the community, but for the most part, that's considered the birth date of the Internet. With that, let me introduce these gentlemen, for those of you who don't know who they are, and I suspect most of you do. First of all, to my immediate left, Vint Cerf, ICANN board chair from 2000 to 2007. He was the founding president of the Internet Society. President George W. Bush awarded Vint and Bob Kahn, who's another very famous Internet pioneer, he awarded them the Presidential Medal of Freedom. This is a big deal. This is the highest civilian award given by the United States to one of its citizens. So that's a pretty big deal. President Bill Clinton later awarded Vint and Kahn the National Medal of Technology for their work in helping to develop the Internet. Currently, Vint works for Google, where he's vice president. He also holds the title of Chief Internet Evangelist. To Vint's left, Leonard Kleinrock, distinguished professor of computer science at UCLA. In 2008, George W. Bush awarded Len the nation's highest scientific honor, the National Medal of Science, for his work in mathematical theory of modern data networks. He is also the recipient of the prestigious Alexander Graham Bell Medal from the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, the IEEE. This award is considered, this is also a big deal, this award is considered one of the highest honors in the world of telecommunication sciences and engineering. To Len's left, we don't know who the hell he is. Steve Crocker was named ICANN board chair in 2011, remained in that position until 2 years ago when he was succeeded by our current chair, Shireen Chalabi. He's the recipient of the prestigious IEEE Internet Award for leadership in the creation of Internet protocols. He was the chair of the Network Working Group, which some of you might not have heard about, but you're going to hear more about it today. An important element in the development of the Internet. He was, as I said, the chair of that organization. And in full disclosure, Steve and I worked closely for a number of years, and I consider him a very good friend. He's a man I'm honored to call a friend. So let's jump into it. The very first question I want to ask you guys, I read your bios, very impressive background. But the thing I really want to know is, what does it feel like to be named after ICANN conference rooms?
I can tell you my reaction is that usually you do that after you're dead. So I keep thinking, God, do they know something I don't know?
Len, I made reference earlier to the first lunar landing and the fact that it occurred only a few months before you guys sent the first message over the Arpanet. We all remember Armstrong's words, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. I'm sure you guys had something equally dramatic and prophetic, right?
That's a lowball question. They were smart. They understood public relations, communications people, PR, and all the rest. We didn't have a message. We didn't have a camera. We didn't have a voice recorder.
And it was 10:30 at night.
Later, and it was an almost empty room. No ceremony. And we can talk about what the message was now or in a few minutes.
Do it. Go for it.
So we didn't have a message. All we wanted to do was log in. See, the idea of the net was that you could sit at one machine and remotely log into another machine and use its services there. Today, that's an obvious thing to do. In those days, that was a novel concept. So we had to get these machines to talk to each other. First thing you have to do is log in so you can get into the machine. And we had a 2-node network set up and said, well, let's try that thing, remote access. So to type login, you have to type LOG. And we had Charlie Klein down at my end and Bill Duval up at the other node, Stanford Research Institute, SRI, and ready to go. Except this is new technology of packet switching. How do you know it's going to work? I mean, we can't see what's happening. So to be sure, we set up a telephone connection between Charlie and Bill. Now look at the irony here. We're using a telephone network to prove a new technology was going to wipe out the telephone network. And it did. So Charlie typed the L and said, you get the L? Bill said, yep, got the L. Printed on his terminal. Type the O, you get the O? Got the O. Type the G, you get the G? Crash. So a few things. First message ever on the network was low. As in, lo and behold. We couldn't have asked for more prophetic, more succinct, more powerful message than that. More powerful than all the others. You know, Samuel Morse, Alexander Graham Bell, Armstrong, low. Now what?
Anybody there?
That took another half hour to get. The question is what broke down? Well, it wasn't the UCLA machine. It wasn't our packet switch. It wasn't the first high-speed line on the network. It wasn't the packet switch at the other end. It was SRI's host computer, so it was their fault.
And just to set up the dynamics, this was sort of your team. Vint and Steve were working on your team, correct?
Yep,
That's right.
that's right.
Did they mess up a lot, or?
No, they were, oh, well, it's interesting.
Now we're getting into the good stuff. Are you rolling on this?
First of all, I gave them enormous freedom, which was the culture at the time.
I thought we just couldn't get your attention.
Misunderstood.
That's a clever management strategy.
And the fact is that they were amazingly creative. It was a diverse team. We had software engineers, we had a hardware engineer, we had programmers, we had staff, and we had a bunch of PhD research students looking at the theory.
So why did we even have this project? Is it okay?
Oh, please,
what
please,
was it,
please.
What was it? Why did the first node of the Arpanet end up at UCLA, Larry?
Well, a few reasons. First reason is I had developed the mathematical theory of packet switching for my PhD dissertation years before, 1962. And when they brought Larry Robertson to run the project at ARPA, he had been a classmate of mine, and he was aware of this. And so he wanted to use the theory I had to establish the cred that this network would actually work. He was being asked to spend millions of dollars of the government's money, and he said he wouldn't have done that if he didn't know that the packets wouldn't fall on the floor.
Or at least theoretically.
Theoretically, well, we simulated it too, but we had to have a proof. And finally, we were going to get it. So not only was the theory there driving it, but he made us into what's called the Network Measurement Center. UCLA was the NMC. It was our job to experiment with the network and see what's wrong with it. In fact, it wasn't just to measure what's happening, but to stress it, to try to break it. It was our job to break it. The guys who were deploying the network, Paul Poranek and Newman, it was their job to bring it up. So they bring it up, we'd break it. They'd bring it up, we'd break it. It was a kind of tension, you might imagine, between the two groups.
Well, wait a minute. Bob Kahn was the guy that came out, and he and I broke it regularly in order for him to prove that there were things that wouldn't work, that his colleagues didn't believe would happen. And so he gets credit on the BB&N side for having cooperated.
That's a very interesting dynamic, because he was a singularity there. And as is typically the case among developers and people who implement, they ignore any theoretical basis for what they're doing. And then they notice it later.
Yeah.
They say, oh my God, what's wrong?
Yeah, well.
And that's true today. It's true of software developers, folks. If it works, it's running. Is it running well? Is it optimized? Is it fault tolerant? Those improvements, the optimization, the performance, does become an issue. And I'm saying it in an extreme way, but typically the theoretical basis for systems are not honored in the implementation. In the case of the Arpanet, though, there was an underlying theory. We knew how it should work, so we're going against a proper blueprint.
Of course, nothing would have happened at all if the guys at BB&N delivered the packet switch to UCLA and to SRI, and we had very crude capabilities there, except Steve took the responsibility for doing something at the host level to make it useful. So how did that happen?
Well, again, the network came up, and there was no easy way to use it. Because for me to use a remote machine, I got to get a login, I got to know the command language, I got to know the applications, and typically that's too big a barrier. So how to make an easy interaction between these remote hosts? Go do it, guys. So it was tossed into Steve's lap, and they did it.
This is 1969.
69.
68 was the beginning.
The beginning, that's right.
So the Arpanet project was organized in a slightly odd way. There was a lot of attention and a lot of planning and all the things you would expect for the IMPs, which were the routers, and the telephone lines and so forth. But what the hosts were going to say to each other, how they were going to use it, was left pretty open. And it was like there were two completely different cultures involved there. Formal government procurement contracts and an RFP for the IMPs and so forth, and no explicit tasking with respect to the development of the protocols. In fact, the idea of developing protocols wasn't explicitly called out. The original notion, we've been going back and reading things carefully, is that, there'd be a way to log in and there'd be a way to move a file, but that was sort of like, must be some software in there.
A small matter of programming.
Small matter of programming, exactly. When the project was kicked off, in the sense that the government had made its commitments and the request for proposals, the request for quotations was out on the street in the summer of '68, there was a meeting of representatives from the first four hosts. Vint and I were delegated to go off to this meeting. It was held in Santa Barbara. And so there were representatives from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and from SRI, and from University of Utah, which were the first four nodes. And most of us had not met each other before, and we were just all in a room. The guy who was chairing the meeting, Elmer Shapiro, had some particular notions that maybe we could do some experiments before we had the network. And others of us started to focus on, well, what was this network going to look like, and what were all the applications? And at least just speaking for myself, it was clear that we weren't going to have the answers to all of that. We didn't know how to build the entire system, and hence we had to leave room for development over time. And that led to the notion of having very thin layers of protocols that you could build on top of, and sort of an open architecture. And that became the watchword, and the telnet and file transfer protocols were fit within this framework, but they weren't the totality of it. And I struggled a lot with an underlying host-to-host protocol to provide the equivalent of a virtual circuit that you could build on. Vint fixed up that work later with the invention of TCP that fixed all the mistakes that...
Well, there weren't mistakes, they were just dependencies on the underlying network, which we wanted to remove.
Yeah. And speaking of mistakes, I want to veer back to the opening comment that Brad made about providing jobs for all of you. One of the mistakes, oversights, or just limitations, I think,
Was hiring us?
we never imagined that the idea of allocating addresses and names was going to be a big deal, small clerical task. We underplayed that slightly, and here we are.
That kind of leads to an obvious question. So the first connection is between UCLA and SRI. How quickly did the number of nodes expand after that successful?
Well,
pretty fast.
the original contract was for BBN to deploy a 19-node network.
Sure.
But part of that was to deploy first a 4-node network. UCLA, SRI, University of California, Santa Barbara, and Utah, as Steve said.
So how quickly did that happen after?
By December, we had 4 nodes up.
Okay.
We paused for a couple of months to shake it out. We had an interesting little topology. We could try parallel pairs and measuring throughput and all the rest. And then it picked up, and by the summer of 70, we had 10 nodes and 2 lines crossing the country already. And then it just continues to grow.
Which strikes me, that's a pretty fast expansion.
Oh, yeah. You know, credit goes, Vint mentioned BB&N, as I did too. BB&N did a terrific job. They had less than 9 months to deliver a switch, new technology, new applications, new users. They delivered it on time, on budget, running. And then they were tasked with leasing lines from AT&T and deploying these things all over the country. They were amazing. It was a really powerful team.
I'm curious about the atmospherics. When that first message successfully was transmitted between UCLA and SRI, what did you guys feel? I mean, did you feel any sense of history, or were you too busy trying to just make this
There was
work?
there was no drama, really. I mean, if there was any drama at all, it was fixing the problem that caused the first crash, which, by the way, Bill Duvall, speaking for him, says, instead of remembering that the damn thing crashed, please remember that within an hour they figured out what the problem was and fixed it so that, it would work. And so he would appreciate it if we'd remember the good part, that it finally was made to work within an hour or so of discovering a problem.
Len, you touched on something I want to follow up on. You were talking about the atmospherics, the way you guys worked and the feelings at the time. You told PC Magazine once, and you were talking about the expansion of the Arpanet and the internet and so on, and you said there was no notion of propriety technology, intellectual property, ownership, or money. None of that. We got our jollies from doing a good job and having someone else say, I like what you did, and I'm going to use it.
You're exactly right, and that was not an unimportant, it was a very important part of the culture and the environment in which we were working. And that stemmed basically from ARPA's way of funding the PIs around the network. They would go to a great researcher and say, we know you're great, here's a pile of money, go do something important. Shoot for the moon.
Pretty unusual for government contracts, right?
Unbelievable. It was the people there. It was Bob Taylor,
Yeah.
and people of that type. The culture was started by Licklider, then Sutherland came in, then Taylor, and that opened this. And so we're not going to bother you. Failure's okay. Here it is for a long time. Do what you need.
So they basically said, do it, we're going to leave you alone.
Exactly. That doesn't happen today, by the way. And that culture was passed on to the workers around the field. But you mentioned before, were these guys any interesting interactions? They were tough. They'd come into my office and say, we need some more travel money. We want to go here and there. You guys remember that, the two of them.
We never got the Arpanet yacht, though. I was really disappointed about that.
They got over. So the money was flowing, and it was rather interesting. These guys, they were not passive, I'll put it that way, which was great. Full of energy, full of creativity.
When we first met in August of '68, the only specific result that came out of that particular meeting was we agreed that we needed to keep talking. And to do that, we wanted to visit each other's laboratories. And so we're talking about relatively small scale by things that you're familiar with today. That meant going up and down the coast of California and occasionally over to Salt Lake City. But even so...
To ski?
To ski? Yeah, there was...
Hey, wait a minute.
If you schedule a meeting in December in Alta,
What else can you do?
I went to that one.
You got to fill the time somehow. But it was instantly clear that this network was supposed to make it possible to cooperate at a distance and eliminate the need for travel. And the first thing we did was schedule a huge amount, comparatively amount of travel, and Len, Professor Kleinrock, I should say, found that his travel budget was getting consumed, and I had the honor of an addition to the contract specifically for my travel, $80,000 for 32 months of travel or something, when cross country was $300.
Len, to quote Nancy Reagan, couldn't you just say no?
Didn't want to. These guys were humming. You want to keep them moving. It was very effective.
So could I come back to the non-proprietary thing?
Please.
It's when Bob and I did the TCP/IP designs in '73, we actually thought about that and wondered, should we patent this? And we were thinking, okay, so remember that the ARPANET was designed and built for resource sharing to link about a dozen universities together so that the researchers could use their hardware capabilities, their computational capabilities, and each other's software And as Len implied, they were all funded, so they didn't have to hide their secrets from each other in order to get funding, for competitive purposes. So anyway, we have this resource sharing thing, but when Bob Kahn started working on the open internet idea, he said, well, this is going to be used for command and control. And so we went through this loop trying to figure out, okay, so first of all, if we design this system, it's going to be used by the U.S. Defense Department, but there will be allies. And so we thought, okay, so who were our allies 25 years before? This was 1973, so we're looking back. And so there's this list. And then we said, who are our allies now? And it's a different list. And then we thought, who will our allies be 25 years from now? And we didn't know. And so we concluded that we couldn't decide how to constrain this technology because we wanted to make sure that our allies would have access to it so we'd have compatibility. Then, so we decided, okay, so let's just release it publicly. Let's have no intellectual property constraints on it so there won't be any barriers to adoption. Somebody can't say, well, I don't want to pay the licensing fee, so I'm not going to use it. We could just imagine IBM and Digital and Hewlett-Packard saying, we have our own networking technologies, we don't need your stuff. So we said, let's just release it publicly, and nobody noticed. So it worked great.
So basically giving away the TCP IP, you're facilitating expansion.
Well, that was the intent. I think there were other things that we did too, like we convinced IBM and Digital and Hewlett-Packard to actually implement the stuff.
Yeah.
But we didn't convince the commercial sector. We went to the research labs and we said, we're going to build this internet thing. You want to play? And they said, yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun. So they did all this TCP IP implementation in their labs. And then we paid Berkeley to implement TCP IP for Unix, which is another very useful, because that propagated everywhere. And I remember hearing the IBM guys complaining because they'd show up at some customer and they try to sell SNA, Systems Network Architecture. And these customers are beginning to hear about internet. And they said, well, can you do this internet thing? And the sales guy says, what's that? And the engineer that they brought along with them says, oh, we have that running in the lab. And so eventually the customers were saying, I like the idea of being able to use technology that allows me to have cross-brand interoperation. And so that, as you say, helped propagate this stuff.
But the fact that there was not a monetization in the minds of the community was very important.
I think you're right.
Would that happen today? Seems like everybody thinks monetization today.
The game's been lost.
Yeah.
Well, wait a minute. There's still a lot of open source, and that's not being monetized.
It's true, but the direction in which so much of the innovation is occurring and the drive and the money behind it is distorting the open sense that we had back then.
Your students, when you're at UCLA and you're teaching and you're working with your grad students and so on, is they're thinking, I want to have the next great app and make $1 million, or explain their mindsets?
First of all, in those days, a PhD student typically did not publish before their dissertation was done.
Right.
Today, you got to get 10 papers out there so you can get hired by Google or University of X.
And is that where their heads are at? Accomplishing that?
Today, yes.
Yeah.
At that time, they were doing good research. They were looking for academic or research positions typically. And there was no sense of doing a startup. There were some small companies going around and being created, but it was not the
entrepreneurship venture, yes.
I'm curious about one thing. We're talking the late 60s, or at least 70s.
Yeah.
We're talking a time of great dissent in the U.S. We're talking about the Vietnam War, huge protests. I mean, I myself was taking part in anti-war demonstrations. Remember that time vividly. How much of that thinking at that time, the sort of distrust of authority, of government, how much did that influence your work and your approaches, or did it?
Steve went to ARPA in 1971.
And I had long hair and a beard.
Oh my! Who wants to see that picture?
It's on the net somewhere.
It's not widely available.
I have to interject something here. I don't know how many of you were with at ICANN 60 when Steve left the board and we had a special session commemorating Steve's departure.
Did they have that
I tried for 6 months to get that damn picture from Steve and his wife Beth. I thought, he won't give it to me. I'm going to go through Beth. Couldn't get it. That thing is in a vault somewhere.
God, he looked like Rasputin.
Who had the longer beard, Crocker or
No,
Pastel?
Pastel had the longer beard,
always
longer hair and longer beard, but mine was long enough. And as Vint said, I actually interrupted my graduate work at UCLA to go work at ARPA because I was fascinated with the opportunity to see the high quality research, not just the network stuff, but everything. And I was offered a job and I took it. I spent 3 years there, and I had a top secret clearance, and anti-war protests were going on outside in Washington all during this period. And toward the very end of my time there, Nixon was forced out of office. As the Watergate hearings were going on during this period. It was pretty frothy period. And as I said, I was sort of dressed for the part. The other side of it is so you went to work for the Defense Department wearing a long hair and a beard. I was not philosophically committed to it. It was kind of accidental that it had grown that way, and I left it. And I thought, okay, I'll get to Washington. It won't work. I'll have to cut it off. And I wanted to see what the reaction would be, and it was really fascinating. It was so thick you could practically cut it. I'd walk into a room, and it was a very positive reaction. Oh, he can't be here because of the way he's dressed. He must know what he's talking about. and it's funny. It's very funny, but it's dead serious. I mean, it was instant credibility.
Must be an engineer. It couldn't be anything else.
Yeah.
I mean,
Steve, why don't you talk about the story when you were almost thrown out of the National Weather Service facility in Boulder?
Oh, so you were raising the issue about the reactions to our military and so forth, and this was a military system, though not very tightly connected to anything military at the time. Plans were put in place to add nodes to this network, and the rate you were asking about was roughly 1 a month. New IMPs were put in, and each IMP could handle up to 4 hosts. So in many cases there were 2, sometimes 3, very occasionally 4 hosts at a site. And one of the places that was scheduled to be added was the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, which is a Department of Commerce, NOAA facility. That plan was in place. The lines had been ordered, and in those days, the lines had 9-month lead time. So you put in an order for a line, and then 9 months later, AT&T would deliver it. So it took a fair amount of time to put all this together. And I went out and visited, and I was taken aback because they said, we didn't agree to this. We're not going to be connected. We don't want to be associated with the Defense Department. And it was quite a hostile reaction. So I went back and reported that, and other arrangements were made of what to do with a line that was already scheduled to be installed in Boulder. So there was an office elsewhere that was beneficiary of this too. But there were instances in which the tension between the political forces.
So at the heart of that, NOAA was basically saying, no, this is a DoD project. We don't want to have anything to do with it.
Yep, it wasn't NOAA. I don't know how much was the management at NCAR versus higher levels up and so forth. But and then of course, in relatively short order, NCAR, like all of the national laboratories, said, "Oh boy, this is neat stuff. We got to be connected one way or the other." But that's okay. I mean, on the whole, things proceeded relatively smoothly.
Len, perhaps as a precursor to what we have today, I read that you actually claim credit for committing possibly the first internet crime with an illegal message. Can you talk about that?
Well, illegal action, actually. It seemed to be illegal. In 1973, there was a major meeting, International Conference on Computer Communications, in Bristol, England, at the University of Sussex.
right.
And a bunch of us went there. They put us up in the dormitories of the university. And I left a day early. Got home, I'm unpacking in Los Angeles, and I realized, my God, I left my electric razor in the cabinet of the dormitory.
It actually worked on 220? That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, we converted it. I carried it in.
I'm just curious.
Drama. And it was now about 3 a.m. in England. I said, what crazy would be on the internet today at 3 a.m.? I said, probably Larry Roberts. So I'm in my bedroom, I go to my terminal, and I type in, I bring up a program which knew it lived in a network. In those days, that was unusual. Something called Resource Sharing Executive, you probably remember that. And I typed in where Roberts. And this piece of software would go out to every host, and there weren't that many at the time, check the who list, and look for Roberts. So I did that, waited a few minutes, clickety, clickety, click. Roberts logged in at BBNN in Cambridge, Mass. as teletype number so-and-so. So I connected with him, we had a chat session, explained what I wanted. Next day, Danny Cohn arrived with my razor. So the illegal use was a personal use of this research engineering network. They got the razor.
And the federal marshals never knocked on your
Never
door.
knocked.
Actually,
I never told them.
There was a different problem that did raise an enormous, nuclear response. Digital Equipment Corporation issued an announcement of an open job position. And the guy that was running the Information Processing Techniques office at the time was Dave Russell. And the reaction was, no use of this technology for commercial purposes. There was a small nuclear explosion in Washington because of that. And so for a long time, we all realized that we're not supposed to do anything on this thing that had anything that smelled like commercial use at all or private sector use.
On April 12th, 1994, that was in the 70s, I believe it was happening.
That was in the 70s, that's right.
April 12th, 1994, we all received an advertisement on our research engineering network. A couple of lawyers advertising their services to be sold.
That. Yes.
Because they were going to help you get on a green card lottery. This thing came out and hit everybody. We said, what the hell is that? You can't advertise on our research network. We said, shame on you. Stop. How dare you? Cease and desist. Turns out we sent so much email back to them, we took down their server. So as an unintended consequence of the first spam message, we created the first denial of service attack.
Pretty good.
But it was out of the bag then. The cat was out of the bag, and boom, the commercialization that we mentioned before just began to spread.
What was your reaction to the commercialization? I mean, before Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web, I'm assuming that most of the traffic was email, correct?
Email and file transfer.
Yeah. Did that mark the explosion of the internet, so to speak?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It deployed it, yes. Another very important event occurred, actually, when they allowed you to use a dial-up modem. You could connect any phone to this dial-up modem and reach into the internet. Suddenly, the internet was worldwide accessible in a very slow, clunky way. But that really was a rapid deployment of access to the technology. It's not a well-known recognition that happened, but it was very important.
Steve, when you and I spoke yesterday, and you mentioned something that I found fascinating. You said that the network created a social structure within the community rather than the other way around. What do you mean by that? Elaborate on that.
Right. So when we talked about that, very, very quickly, the people that we were interacting with to build the network became friends, colleagues, and relationships started to build of all kinds. Unfortunately, most of us were men, so the relationships were somewhat limited in those days, but even so. And you fired back and you said, I thought the community built the network. And I said, yes, the technical community built the network. And then of those of us who were building it, we formed various kinds of relationships and social networks. So there was kind of an interplay there. And the seeds of many of the things that are fully evident today.
You're talking about social media, sort of
social
thing.
media of all kinds, positive and negative behaviors and so forth. So once in a while, somebody would do something that was obnoxious, and so you'd have to go find them and track them down, or get somebody to put some pressure on it. And I don't think we fully anticipated what happens when you scale this up from a few dozen nodes and a few hundred people to a few billion people. Spread all over the world. There's nobody you can call to fix those kind of problems these days. But it became important in a very natural way that we build relationships across country and nowadays around the world. Just happened. And, oftentimes, closer and more frequent interactions over the net than in the next office or in the next or in town.
I'm curious, when you gents look at where we are now and look back at the work you did then, I realize you were in the technical realm, but you were also, at least to some degree, thinking of the impact of your work. Do you think we should have done X, Y, or Z? There's something we should have done differently?
Well, I have one reaction. When Bob and I were doing the internet design, we did a computation to figure out how many terminations we thought we might need. We said, this is 1973, so we just had done the Arpanet and it's expanding. And so we said, okay, how many networks will there be per country? And we guessed there would be 2 because there ought to be some competition. And then we said, okay, so how many countries are there? And there wasn't any Google to ask, so we guessed at 128 because that's the power of 2, and that's what programmers think in. So 2 times 128 is 256, that's 8 bits of network address. And then we said, remember in 1973, how many computers will there be on the network? And we said, well, let's go for broke. How about 16 million, because that's 24 bits. So there's a 32-bit address. If it's fully populated, it's 4.3 billion terminations. And we thought that's enough for an experiment. That's more than there are people in the world at the time in 1973. Well, we were wrong. And as we discovered in 2011, we ran out of IPv4 address space. Fortunately, in 1996, the engineers of the Internet Engineering Task Force recognized the problem, rapid proliferation of local area nets, and realized that we had to develop a different addressing structure. And so IPv6 took 4 years, but it's born, and now we can have 3.4 times 10 to the 38th addresses, which is a number only the Congress can appreciate. And that's what we're pushing for, except that only about 30% penetration right now. And so, I have a T-shirt that says, IPv6 on everything. We really need to do something to get that done. But I wanted to respond on the social thing for a second. The development of networked electronic mail came around 1971 or so. It was Bill... Ray Tomlinson, thank you. Ray Tomlinson came up with this notion of extending the idea of email that was already common on time-sharing systems to be networked. And he realizes he needs to say, where is this message going? Which computer is it going to, and to which user? And he needs some way of distinguishing those 2 identifiers, and he looks at the keyboard to find something that is not already used by other operating systems as a separation character. And he chooses the @ sign, which is perfect, right? User at host. So that's where that came from. So in 71, he introduces his idea. Everybody gets all excited. We start using email. And to Steve's point, it was the thought that we could use that to avoid travel. And if you tested that theory 5 years later, you discovered the travel budget went up by a factor of 4. And the reason is that we actually got bigger projects over a larger geographic span, and we still needed to get together, but that meant there were more people traveling longer distances, so much for saving money. The first email distribution list that came out, this gets to the social networking thing, were sci-fi lovers, because, we're all a bunch of engineers and we argue about who are the best science fiction writers, and Yum Yum, which is a restaurant review for restaurants up in Stanford, or in the Palo Alto area. So it was obvious right away that this had a social element to it. So that's one point, and clearly that's expanded over time. The other thing, which I think Steve deserves a lot of credit for, is the creation of institutions at need. And so Steve creates the network working group in order to do the host-to-host protocols on the Arpanet. That extended into the international network working group, which involved a lot of people from Europe and some from Asia. And then the Internet Architecture Board, which started out as the Internet Configuration Control Board. Then the IETF, which spun out from that. And then the Internet Society, which got started in '92. And then ICANN, which got started in '98. But the point I want to make is that the creation of institutions is something that this community did at need, not ahead of time, but as it became apparent that they were needed. And they have persisted astonishingly over decades.
Let me follow up on that. You told Wired Magazine, you were talking about the organic growth. And you said the closest thing that was in any way close to central control was ICANN.
Yes, pretty much. That cost us a lot of difficulty when the World Summit on the Information Society was convened in 2003. The first question that the diplomats, remember this is a UN thing, the first question that the diplomats asked was, what's an information society? And everybody said, oh, it's like the internet and the World Wide Web. And so the first question the diplomats had was, so who's in charge of the internet? And, they looked around and they decided, oh, it must be ICANN, because they manage the domain name system and the internet addresses and everything else. And then they said, so who's in charge of ICANN? And they discovered the Department of Commerce and the National Telecommunications and Information Agency. And so it's obvious that the U.S. is in charge of the internet. And it has taken many, many years to get to the point where that view has shifted to some extent.
I'm curious what you guys think. We had Ira Magaziner here doing a similar sort of fireside chat with us.
That must have been interesting.
It was fascinating. It was truly fascinating. I'm curious what you guys think. If we had not had Ira Magaziner from the Clinton White House, who basically saw the commercial possibilities of the internet and its expansion into that realm and wanted to develop that more fully, if we had not had him, would the commercialization have happened as quickly?
Well, there was another Washington player who had a big role to play, a fellow named Al Gore.
Oh, right, right.
He was the biggest proponent in the late 80s of this thing called the internet.
That's true.
Most knowledgeable, most present. And he convinced the first President Bush to sign into law as one of his last acts, what was called a high-performance computer communication system.
This was when he was in the Senate, right?
Yeah, in the Senate.
That's while he was in the Senate, that's right.
And he was
86.
responsible for helping get the gigabit backbone in industry, academia, and government to work together. So he had a real, I noticed the snickers here when I mentioned his name. That was an unfortunate, out-of-context event. But you mentioned Ira Magaziner. Al Gore early on was very strong. So government played a real role, not only in funding this thing initially, but in helping launch it into the commercial world.
Specifically with regard to commercialization, when Al became vice president, there was a piece of legislation called the voucher bill. And that officially permitted commercial traffic to flow on the government-sponsored backbones through the Department of Energy, the Department of Commerce, and so on, National Science Foundation, NASA, as well as ARPA. And that legislation opened up the opportunities for commercial use of the system. Magaziner shows up in 1997, and at the time, just at that point, he had released a report on electronic commerce, and that was during the Clinton administration. And so it was timely that that report was released, just as this question of how does the internet get managed lands on his plate.
I remember when I interviewed you for the History Project, and part of the interview that sticks in my mind the most, we were talking about the linkage or the role, the connection between ICANN and government. And I remember your description vividly, and you said it was problematic. At times beneficial, at times amazingly problematic. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I think the issue that became very apparent thanks to the WSIS and the thing that followed, remember the WSIS couldn't figure out exactly what to do with internet governance. They created a working group called WIGIG, the Working Group on Internet Governance, and that could not come to a resolution about how the internet should be governed. And so they created the Internet Governance Forum in order to continue that discussion. And in the course of the Internet Governance Forum meetings, which continue to this day, the next one is in Berlin in November, there was persistent debate about the role of the U.S. government and its oversight of ICANN. And that continued to be a burr under the saddle for a lot of people. And so the successful release of ICANN from the official oversight by NTIA during Steve's time as chairman,
transition.
That transition in 2016 was a very, very important step in the history not only of ICANN but of internet.
Let me ask all you gentlemen. As much as I would like to think that this is the first time you've ever answered these questions, I know it isn't. When you look back on the development of the Arpanet and later the internet, what is the one thing that you're never asked about? What is the element that you think is not on people's radar that should be, if anything?
Well, they seldom ask about the culture. You have to bring that up. I feel that's a very important component. Open, free, shared, ethical culture among well-behaved participants. That's never even addressed, and I think that's worthwhile stating.
Anything, Ben? Steve? Anything else?
It's an intriguing question. I don't think I've been asked that question exactly that way. I'm still thinking about it. I'm going to pass to Vint while I continue to think.
Well, let me suggest that what we currently hear a lot about is abuse of this platform. And it's painful in many ways to see and hear and experience this, because when we were building it, we had a great deal of positive expectation, which has been greatly satisfied and fulfilled. I mean, with the World Wide Web's arrival was really quite important because it made things so much more accessible. It was easier for people to share information. They still do. Many people share information without any expectation of monetization or anything else, although there's also a lot of interest in monetization, and that's okay. This is sort of the big tent. The problem, of course, is that once the general public gets access to this platform, you find people who are motivated by some nefarious ideas, and it's very harmful. And what it leads to not only is direct harm from people who are using the system, but it also introduces government reaction, which is understandable in two senses. The authoritarian governments see this open platform as a risk because people can organize around that, as happened in the Arab Spring, and so they want to suppress that. Bad for them is anything that's inimical to their administration. On the other hand, even in democratic societies like ours, bad translates into harm to the citizens. And the worst part about it is because the internet is global in scope, the harm can cross international boundaries. And so the topic which comes up at this point repeatedly is, what are we going to do about the harmful side effects of this online environment without losing all of the positive value which we already know exists and can continue to contribute to our economic and social well-being. So that's an unsolved problem.
As I was reflecting on your question, and I reminded that I did get asked an interesting question that took me by surprise. I was getting a tour of the hills in Peru, in the Sacred Valley, and the arrangements to go visit a school came apart, and there was some hurried phone calls and some alternate arrangements were made, which is relevant because the question that I got asked when I was there could not possibly have been prepared and prepped. And we're talking about young teenagers, I think. And I give a little talk about the internet. And this kid asks, and we're in rural, I mean, there's high mountains and there's no cities around and everything. This is pretty far removed from center of civilization in a way. He says, why did the Department of Defense, why did the U.S. military build a network that was useful for everybody around the world? And I thought that was a very heads-up question, that he was trying to understand what the motivation was. And I found myself trying to build a picture of how important science and technology had become, certainly out of the World War II experience, and that culture created ARPA, and within ARPA, a very long-term view as well as the more shorter-term urgencies that they pursued, and created an environment that made it possible to build a network that was not, build it today, we're going to use it for this campaign, this military campaign, or this military system tomorrow, but instead build the basis for those things far in the future. So I thought that was a really interesting question.
It was. Before we break up, I wanted to mention one thing. Moises, if you can hit that slide for us. We're not only celebrating the anniversary of the internet, we're celebrating Steve Crocker's anniversary. So we have a little cake back here. He told me he was 27. I didn't believe it.
Wow, how about that? That's a real cake.
So please, everybody have some cake. Maybe you want to chat these gentlemen up individually. And guys, thank you very much. This was fantastic. Appreciate it.